The moment he stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the air changed. It was cooler, for one thing, and carried a scent of old wood, floor polish, and something else. Something like expectation. This was the grand hall of the conservatory, and to Leo it felt less like a concert hall and more like a cathedral. A cathedral built not for God, but for music. His eyes, wide and trying to take everything in at once, traced the soaring ceilings, the gilded balconies that curled like ribbons along the walls, and the heavy, deep red curtains that framed the stage. It was all so grand, so perfect, that it made the simple, worn-out t-shirt he wore feel like a burlap sack. He was 19, and he had never felt more like a child playing dress-up in his father's shoes. He clutched the folder containing his sheet music, his knuckles white. The folder itself was a source of quiet shame. It wasn't a fancy leather binder like the ones he saw other contestants carrying. It was a simple, black plastic folder he'd bought at a stationery store back home, its edges already starting to fray. Inside, the pages of his chop-in book were soft and dog-eared, the corners bent from years of being propped open on the worn, upright piano that lived in his small town's community center. That piano had character. It had a soul. Some of the ivories on the lower keys were chipped, and if you played a G-sharp too softly, it might not make a sound at all. It was a flawed, honest instrument. The piano that sat center stage on this massive platform was the complete opposite. It was a gleaming black Steinway, so polished it looked like a pool of liquid night. It didn't just sit there. It commanded the room. It was an altar, and Leo felt like he was the one about to be sacrificed. He could almost hear it humming with the memory of the thousands of brilliant fingers that had danced across its keys. Legends had played this piano. He was just Leo, from a town so small you could miss it if you blinked while driving through. His teacher, a kind woman with silver hair and hands that were gnarled like tree roots from a lifetime of playing, had told him he had a gift. But looking at this hall, at this piano, he felt like a fraud. The other contestants didn't help. They moved with a confidence that seemed to be baked into their very bones. They gathered in small groups, their laughter echoing softly in the vast space. Leo stood near the back, trying to make himself invisible, and just listened. He heard snippets of conversations that felt like they were in a foreign language. They talked about their conservatories, their famous mentors, their summers at music festivals in exotic places. One girl, dressed in a sleek black dress that probably cost more than his first car, was complaining about the difficulty of finding the right kind of rosin for her bow. A tall, thin boy with perfectly styled hair was describing a master class he'd taken in Vienna. Leo had only ever seen that city in books. He felt a pang of homesickness so sharp it almost hurt. He missed the familiar squeak of the third pedal on his old piano. He missed the smell of rain on the dusty pavement outside the community center. He missed the way his teacher would make him a cup of tea after a lesson, telling him not to worry about hitting every single note perfectly. "Music isn't a math problem, Leo," she would say, her voice warm and raspy. "It's a feeling. It's a story. Don't just play the notes. Tell the story the notes are trying to whisper." That was his whole musical education, wrapped up in her simple words. He had learned to play with his heart, to let the emotion of the piece guide his fingers. But here, looking around, it seemed like everyone else had learned to play with their heads, with a precision and technical skill that was intimidating to even witness. He watched as one contestant went up to the stage to warm up. The boy sat at the Steinway, and his fingers immediately began to fly across the keys in a flurry of scales and arpeggios that were so fast and clean they sounded like a machine. It was perfect, flawless, and to Leo it was completely empty. There was no feeling, no story, just a breathtaking display of technical ability. A few of the judges, who were seated at a long table in the center of the hall, nodded in approval. One of them, a man with a severe face and silver hair slicked back from his forehead, even smiled a thin, approving smile. This was the director of the competition, a famous pianist whose records Leo had listened to with a mixture of awe and terror. He was a legend, known for his demanding standards and his intolerance for anything less than technical perfection. Leo's heart started to beat a little faster. a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. He looked down at his own hands. They were clean, but his nails were short and unpolished. They were the hands of someone who had worked, not just at the piano, but at odd jobs back home to save up for the trip to this competition. These hands knew how to feel the music, but could they ever produce that kind of cold, perfect sound? He doubted it. His style was all about the small pauses, the slight variations in tempo, the way he would linger on a note just a second longer to let the emotion sink in. He had a feeling the director would hate it. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm that was brewing in his chest. He was here for a reason. He had driven for 10 hours in a beat-up car to get here. He had practiced until his fingers ached, not because he wanted to be famous, but because he believed in the music. He believed that a piece by Chopin wasn't just a collection of notes on a page. It was a story about love and loss and longing. It was a story that everyone in some way could understand. He was here to tell that story. He opened his folder and looked at the first piece he was supposed to play, a simple Bach prelude. The notes were stark and black on the white page. They looked like they were mocking him. He closed the folder, his hands trembling slightly. He was a storyteller with a cheap book in a room full of scholars with ancient, leather-bound texts, and he was about to be asked to read aloud. He just hoped anyone, would want to listen to his version of the story. The voice that called his name echoed through the hall, crisp and professional, but to Leo it sounded like a judge's gavel coming down. It was his turn. A path of light seemed to open up from the wings of the stage to the single, lonely bench waiting for him under the spotlight. The walk felt longer than any road he had ever driven down. With each step, the soft rubber solace of his worn-out shoes made no sound on the polished wooden floor, and he felt like a ghost walking into a world where he didn't belong. The lights were brighter than he expected, warm on his skin but blinding when he tried to look out at the audience. All he could see was a vast, dark sea of shapes, hundreds of people sitting in silent judgment. He could feel their collective gaze on him, a physical weight that made his shoulders hunch slightly. He finally reached the center of the stage, and the magnificent Steinway. He paused for a moment, his hand hovering over the smooth, black surface before he sat down on the bench. It was firm, much firmer than the wobbly wooden stool he was used to at home. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys, not pressing them down, just feeling the cool, smooth ivory. They were perfect. Each key was exactly the same size, perfectly weighted, promising a sound that was pure and even. It was a machine built for perfection, and he felt a deep, unsettling fear that his own hands, which were used to the quirks and character of his old piano, would not be worthy of it. He took a slow, deep breath, the air tasting of dust and old velvet, and placed his sheet music on the stand. The notes of the Bach prelude stared back at him. Black and sharp and unforgiving, he placed his fingers on the keys, finding the starting position. He had practiced this piece 100 times, trying to make it as clean and precise as possible. He knew this was what they wanted. They wanted to see that he could control the notes, that he could build a perfect, structured piece of music with no mistakes. So he began. The first notes rang out, clear and steady, like a series of small, perfect bells. He focused on his technique, on keeping the rhythm exact, on making sure each note was distinct from the last. It felt like building a wall, brick by brick, making sure every line was straight and true. It was technically correct, but it felt empty to him. He was a storyteller being forced to recite the alphabet dot as he played. Moving through the intricate patterns of the prelude, he started to relax just a little. The familiar motions of his fingers began to soothe his nerves. He found a tiny bit of space within the rigid structure of the music to be himself. He let a particular note hang in the air just a fraction of a second longer than written, a tiny breath in the middle of a perfectly constructed sentence. He softened the touch on a quiet passage, letting it become a whisper instead of a statement. It was his small rebellion, his way of putting a tiny piece of his soul into the music without breaking the rules. For a brief moment, he started to feel it. He wasn't just playing notes anymore. He was weaving a small, delicate story. He felt a flicker of connection, not just with the piano, but with the silent room. He dared to think, Maybe they can feel it too. It was in that moment of fragile hope that he made the mistake. He risked a quick glance up from the keys towards the judge's table. He wanted to see if his small act of defiance had been noticed, if there was any sign of approval on their faces. The other judges were stoic, their expressions unreadable as they scribbled notes on their papers. But then his eyes found the director, the man with the severe face and slicked-back silver hair. He wasn't looking at his paper. He was looking right at Leo, and as their eyes met, the man leaned over to the judge sitting next to him. Leo couldn't hear the words over the sound of his own playing, but he could see the man's lips move, forming a short, sharp sentence. Then it happened. A small, sharp, dismissive smirk curled the corner of the director's mouth. It wasn't a big gesture. It was tiny, almost imperceptible, but to Leo it was as loud as a gunshot. It was a flicker of pure contempt, a look that said everything without a single word. It said, "I see what you're trying to do, and it's amateurish. It's sentimental nonsense. You don't belong here." The other judge gave a short, curt nod of agreement, and they both looked back at Leo, their faces now masks of cold indifference. The smirk hit him like a physical blow. A cold, sharp feeling shot through his chest, instantly freezing the fragile warmth he had been building. The connection between his heart and his fingers was severed, cut clean by that single, arrogant expression. The music he was playing suddenly felt foreign, like a language he no longer understood. The story he was trying to tell evaporated, leaving behind only the dry, mechanical task of hitting the right notes at the right time. His fingers, which had just moments before been dancing with a hint of feeling, now felt like clumsy blocks of wood. He stumbled on a note, a tiny, audible mistake that made him flinch. It was a small error, one that most people might not have even noticed. But to him, it was a confirmation of the director's judgment. He was a fraud. He fought his way through the rest of the piece, his mind a fog of humiliation. He wasn't thinking about the music anymore. He was just trying to survive, to get to the end without making another mistake. Each note was a struggle, a small victory that felt like a defeat. The joy was gone, replaced by a desperate, clawing need for it to be over. He played the final chords of the prelude, his hands landing on the keys with a heavy thud that was more relief than artistry. The last note hung in the air for a moment, stark and lonely, and then silence. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. It wasn't a breathless, appreciative silence. It was an empty, waiting silence. Then the applause began. It wasn't a roar or even an enthusiastic clapping. It was a smattering of polite, unimpressed applause that sounded like rain lightly tapping on a tin roof. It was the kind of applause people give when they feel obligated to be polite, the sound of an audience patiently waiting for the next person to come on stage. It was the most crushing sound he had ever heard. He stood up quickly, gave a short, stiff bow that he didn't feel, and turned to walk off the stage. The walk back to the wings was a walk of shame. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, feeling the weight of hundreds of indifferent stares on his back. He had come here to tell a story, and they had not only rejected the story, they had rejected the storyteller. He melted back into the shadows of the wings, his heart pounding with a painful, hollow rhythm. The image of the director's smirk burned into his mind. The shadows of the wings swallowed him whole, and the heavy velvet curtain felt like a wall being lowered between him and the world that had just judged him so harshly. Backstage was a different universe. It was cramped and cluttered, a chaotic mess of wires, instrument cases, and half-empty water bottles. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and old fabric. It was the opposite of the pristine, gleaming hall he had just left, and in a way it was a comfort. This Messias felt more like the real world, more like his world. He found a small, worn wooden bench tucked away behind a large speaker and sank down onto it, his body feeling heavy and boneless. His hands were trembling. He clenched them into fists, trying to stop the shaking, but it was no use. The tremors went deeper than his muscles. They were in his very bones. All he could see was the director's face, the cruel, dismissive smirk etched onto his memory like a brand. It played over and over in his mind, a silent, looping film of his own humiliation. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. He had been so foolish to think he could compete here, so arrogant to believe that his simple, heartfelt way of playing had any place in this temple of technical perfection. They hadn't just rejected his music. They had stripped him of his identity, leaving him feeling small and exposed. A raw, burning anger began to bubble up from the pit of his stomach, hot and sharp. It was a powerful feeling, much stronger than the shame, and he clung to it. Anger felt like fuel. It felt like a weapon. He was supposed to play one more piece, his final choice. He had planned it for months, a Liszt etude that was a monster of technical difficulty. It was a piece designed to showcase speed, power, and precision, a fireworks display of notes that could leave an audience breathless. He had practiced it relentlessly, his fingers aching, his mind focused on nothing but hitting every single note with flawless accuracy. He had chosen it as his secret weapon, his proof that he wasn't just a feeling player, that he had the chops to hang with the best of them. Looking back, the piece took on a new, darker meaning. It was no longer just a showcase. It was a weapon of revenge. He began to picture it. He would walk back out onto that stage, his face a mask of cold determination. He would sit at that perfect Steinway and unleash a storm of sounds so technically brilliant, so ferociously perfect that it would shatter their expectations. He imagined the director's face as his fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion producing a cascade of flawless notes. He pictured the smirk vanishing, replaced by a look of shock, then grudging respect. He imagined the other judges, their pens frozen above their papers, their eyes wide with disbelief. He would show them. He would beat them at their own game. He would prove he was just as much of a machine as any of their polished, perfect students. The thought gave him a grim, fierce satisfaction. It was a plan. It was a way to fight back. He reached into his bag and pulled out his sheet music, his fingers finding the Liszt piece. The pages were covered in his own frantic pencil marks, reminders of fingerings and tricky passages. He stared at the notes, a dense forest of black ink on the page. He tried to hear the music in his head, the thundering chords, the lightning-fast runs, but the sound that came back to him was hollow. It was loud, yes. It was impressive, certainly. But as he sat there in the dusty quiet of backstage, a small voice started to whisper in the back of his mind. It was a quiet voice, but it was persistent. Asterisk, is this why you started playing? Asterisk, the question stopped him cold. Why had he started playing? He closed his eyes, and the image of the Liszt notes faded, replaced by a different memory. He was a little boy, sitting on a rickety stool in his teacher's small living room. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. His teacher was beside him, her kind, wrinkled face close to his. "Don't just bang the keys, Leo," she had said, her voice soft and warm. "Listen to what they're saying. This one," she said, pointing to a low, mournful chord, "is sad. It's saying goodbye. And this one," her finger dancing up to a high, bright note, "is happy. It's saying hello again." She wasn't teaching him notes. She was teaching him a language. The language of the heart. He remembered the feeling of that old, upright piano, the way it seemed to have its own personality. He remembered how he could lose hours just playing, not because he had to practice, but because he was having a conversation with the music. He played to tell stories, to share feelings he couldn't put into words. He played because it made him feel less alone in the world. The Liszt piece wasn't a story. It was a statement. A loud, aggressive, look at me statement. Playing it would be a betrayal of everything his teacher had taught him. It would be a betrayal of himself. The anger inside him began to cool, replaced by a quiet, heavy sadness. He felt torn in two, like he was being pulled in opposite directions. One part of him still craved that revenge, that validation from the people who had mocked him. He wanted to win on their terms, to force them to admit he was good enough. But another, deeper part of him knew it would be an empty victory. If he won by becoming someone he wasn't, then he hadn't really won at all. He would have lost the very thing that made his music special. He sat there for a long time, the two feelings warring inside him. The muffled sound of another contestant playing drifted through the curtain, a piece that was technically brilliant, but, to his ears, completely soulless. It was the sound of the competition. It was the sound of everything he was fighting against. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. He realized that the director's smirk wasn't just an attack on his playing. It was an attack on his belief that music was more than just perfect notes. By playing the list, he would be proving the director right. He would be saying, "You're right. Feeling doesn't matter. Only technique matters." A quiet defiance began to simmer in his chest, replacing the hot anger. It wasn't a loud, explosive feeling. It was a calm, steady resolve. He wasn't going to fight them on their terms. He was going to fight on his. He slowly put the list music back into his bag, his hand moving with a new sense of purpose. He reached in again and pulled out his dog-eared chopping book. His fingers, as if by their own will, flipped through the pages until they found the ballade No. 1. He looked at the notes, and this time he could hear the music in his head, clear as a bell. It started with a gentle, questioning whisper, a story waiting to be told. It grew into a passionate, swirling dance of emotion, full of longing and conflict. It had moments of breathtaking beauty and moments of terrifying, stormy rage. It was an epic journey contained in a single piece of music. It was everything he was and everything they said he shouldn't be. It was messy and complicated and deeply, profoundly human. It was not a display of technique. It was a confession of the soul. He closed the book, holding it in his lap. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was what he had to play. He might lose. The director might smirk again. The audience might be confused. But he would be true to himself. He would go out there and tell his story with all its imperfections and all its heart. He would play the music the way his teacher had taught him, not as a math problem to be solved, but as a feeling to be shared. A small, calm smile touched his lips. He was no longer afraid. He was ready. The voice calling his name didn't feel like a gavel this time. It felt like an opening. The walk from the wings to the center of the stage was the same distance, but Leo covered it with an entirely new stride. There was no hesitation, no feeling of being an imposter. His back was straight, his gaze fixed not on the blinding lights or the dark sea of faces, but on the gleaming black Steinway waiting for him. It was no longer an altar of sacrifice. It was a partner, a confidant. He was not here to be judged. He was here to speak. He sat down on the bench, the firmness of it a solid, grounding presence. He didn't rush to place his fingers on the keys. Instead, he took a moment, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. He could feel the low hum of the hall, the collective energy of hundreds of people waiting, but he wasn't afraid of it anymore. He was going to use it. He opened his eyes, a quiet calm settled over him, and gently rested his fingers on the cool ivory. He had decided not to use the sheet music. The ballade wasn't in the pages. It was in him. It was his story. He began. The first notes were not a declaration, but a whisper. A soft, questioning phrase that hung in the air like a wisp of smoke. It was fragile, uncertain, full of a gentle melancholy. In the audience, a few people shifted in their seats. It was the same quiet, unimpressive opening they had heard before. A woman in the second row discreetly glanced at her watch. The director at his table picked up his pen, his face a mask of bored expectation, ready to write his final, dismissive notes, but then something started to change. The quiet introduction began to weave a spell. Leo wasn't just playing the notes. He was caressing them, lingering on each one just a fraction of a second longer than was technically correct, pulling out a hidden depth of feeling. The gentle question of the opening notes began to feel more personal, more urgent. It was the sound of loneliness, of a heart searching for something it couldn't name. The restless shuffling in the audience began to subside. The woman with the watch let her hand fall back into her lap. The air in the hall grew still, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. The main theme of the ballade entered, and with it a new wave of emotion. It was a beautiful, flowing melody, but under Leo's fingers it was more than just pretty. It was a story of longing, of a deep and aching homesickness. He was thinking of his small town, of his teacher's kind face, of the chipped keys on his old piano. He poured all of that love and all of that loss into the music. His body began to sway slightly, a natural, unconscious movement, as if he were being rocked by the waves of his own emotions. He was no longer on a stage. He was adrift in the sea of memory, and the piano was his only vessel. From the judge's table, the director's pen had stopped moving. He was leaning forward now, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't just hearing the music, he was listening. The smirk was long gone, replaced by a look of intense, bewildered focus. He couldn't find anything to criticize. There were small technical imperfections, a rubato that was too free, a dynamic that was too bold, but they all served a purpose. They all told a story. It was a way of playing he had been taught to suppress, a style he had long believed was amateurish. But hearing it now, delivered with such raw honesty, he felt a strange and unfamiliar feeling. He was being moved. The music began to build in intensity, the gentle longing turning into a more passionate, desperate plea. The quiet conversation between the hands became a heated argument. Leo's fingers moved with a new power, the sound growing from a whisper to a roar. The audience was completely captivated. A young man in the front row, who had been slumping in his seat with an air of boredom, was now bolt upright, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly agape. The entire hall was under a spell. The world outside this room, with its noise and distractions, had ceased to exist. There was only the sound of the piano and the story it was telling. Then the storm broke. The music erupted into a tempest of furious, cascading notes, a torrent of sound that was both terrifying and breathtaking. This was the technical heart of the piece, a whirlwind of chords and runs that could be a mere display of virtuosity. But for Leo, it was the climax of his story. It was his anger, his frustration, his defiance. It was the memory of the director's smirk, the feeling of being an outsider, the desperate, screaming need to prove his own worth. His hands flew across the keys, a blur of motion, his entire body tensed with the effort. He wasn't just playing loudly. He was unleashing a lifetime of feeling in a few cataclysmic moments. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped down his temples, but he didn't notice. He was lost in the eye of the storm, channeling its raw, untamable power. As suddenly as it began, the storm subsided, giving way to a brief, hauntingly beautiful calm. The music became quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the exhausted peace after a great battle, the reflective stillness after a torrential downpour. It was a moment of pure, heartbreakingly beautiful clarity. Leo's touch was featherlight, the notes like teardrops on still water. It was in this moment that the full weight of what they were all experiencing settled upon the room. It wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a shared emotional journey, but the respite was temporary. The final cataclysmic coda began, a series of thunderous, crashing chords that drove the story to its inevitable, shattering conclusion. This was the end. There was no more hope, no more longing, only a final, defiant roar against the darkness. Leo put everything he had into it, every last ounce of his strength, his heart, and his soul. His body rocked with the force of the chords, his feet pounding the pedals. He hammered the final, devastating chords, and the last note hung in the air with a shattering finality. Then there was silence. It wasn't a polite pause before the applause. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a profound, breathless silence that filled the entire hall, thick and heavy with the echo of the story that had just been told. No one moved. No one clapped. No one breathed. It was as if the sound had been so immense, so all-consuming, that it had left a vacuum in its wake. The audience, the judges, everyone was frozen in place, their minds still reeling from the emotional journey they had just taken. They were utterly, completely silenced by the raw, undeniable truth of what they had just heard. In the heavy, vibrating stillness of the grand hall, Leo, breathing heavily, his shirt soaked with sweat, finally lifted his hands from the keys. He had told his story. And for the first time all day, everyone was listening. The silence was the loudest sound he had ever heard. It stretched on, thick and heavy, pressing in on him from all sides. The last note of the ballade had faded, but its ghost still hung in the air, vibrating in the bones of the hall and in the chest of every person present. Leo sat frozen, his hands still resting on the keys, his fingers throbbing. His own breathing was ragged and loud in his ears, a stark contrast to the profound stillness of the room. He was empty, spent, a vessel that had poured out everything it held. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were floating above the scene, looking down at this young man with a sweaty face and a torn t-shirt, sitting at a giant piano in a room full of strangers. For a moment, he wasn't sure if what had just happened was real or a dream. He could feel the ache in his shoulders, the burn in his forearms. He had poured every ounce of his physical and emotional energy into those final moments. His heart was still beating a frantic, uneven rhythm like a bird trying to escape its cage. He slowly lifted his hands from the keys and placed them in his lap, his fingers trembling uncontrollably. He stared out into the darkness, but he still couldn't see any faces clearly. The lights were too bright, turning the audience into a single, shadowy entity. He wondered what they were thinking. Were they confused? Bored? Offended by his raw, unpolished display of emotion? He braced himself for the polite, smattering of applause he had received before. He prepared himself for the quiet walk of shame back into the wings. Then a single sound broke the spell. It was a sharp, audible gasp from the balcony, a sound of pure, uncontrolled emotion. It was like the first crack in a dam. And then the dam broke. A roar of sound erupted from the audience, so sudden and so powerful that it physically rocked him back on the bench. It wasn't just clapping. It was a visceral, explosive release of all the tension and emotion that had been building during his performance. It was a wave of sound that crashed over the stage, a tidal wave of adoration and awe. The whole audience seemed to rise as one, a wave of people standing up, their hands coming together in a thunderous rhythm that shook the very foundations of the hall. Leo saw a man in the front row, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He saw a woman with her hands clasped to her mouth, her face a mask of disbelief and wonder. They weren't just applauding a performance. They were acknowledging a shared experience. They were thanking him for taking them on that journey with him. The sound was not polite. It was not reserved. It was raw and it was real. It was the sound of people who had been truly moved. His eyes, still wide with shock, drifted towards the judge's table. He expected to see them scribbling notes, discussing technicalities, maintaining their professional composure. But they weren't. Every single one of them was on their feet, their faces filled with a mixture of shock and pure, unadulterated admiration. They were clapping as hard as anyone in the audience, their expressions open and vulnerable. The woman who had been so stern during his first piece was smiling, a genuine, radiant smile that transformed her face. The man next to her was nodding his head, a look of deep respect on his face. They weren't judges anymore. They were listeners. And they had been conquered, but Leo's search didn't stop there. His eyes scanned the table, looking for one face, one reaction that mattered more than all the others combined. He found him. The director. The man with the severe face and the silver hair. The man whose smirk had started this whole fire inside him. For a heart-stopping moment, Leo's breath caught in his throat. The director was still seated. While the entire world around him was on its feet, he remained in his chair, his face unreadable, his hands resting calmly on the table in front of him. A cold knot of dread formed in Leo's stomach. Had it not been enough? Had his story, his soul, still failed to penetrate that fortress of technical perfection? Was the director's final act of defiance to remain seated, to refuse to acknowledge this emotional outburst as valid art? The applause of the crowd, the adoration of the other judges, it all suddenly felt hollow. This one man's approval or disapproval still held a strange power over him. He watched, his heart pounding, as the director simply sat there, looking at the stage, looking at him, his expression a complete mystery, the seconds stretched into an eternity. The applause continued to roar, but for Leo, the world had shrunk to this one silent, seated man. He felt a familiar wave of self-doubt wash over him. Maybe he had just made a fool of himself. Maybe he had just thrown a tantrum on a piano, and the director was the only one with the sense to see it, and then slowly the director moved. He placed his hands flat on the table and pushed his chair back. It was a slow, deliberate motion, full of weight and meaning. Then, just as slowly, he rose to his feet. He wasn't hurried. He wasn't reacting to the pressure of the crowd. He was acting on his own conclusion. He stood there for a moment, tall and imposing, his eyes locked on Leo, and then he brought his hands together. He didn't just clap. He began a slow, deliberate, and deeply respectful applause. It was a clap that said more than any words could. It was an admission. It was a surrender. It was the ultimate sign of respect from the one person Leo thought it was impossible to get it from Dot in that moment. Something inside Leo broke and was remade. The knot of dread in his stomach dissolved, replaced by a warm, spreading feeling of peace. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, tired, and deeply happy smile. He had done it. He hadn't just won the competition. He had won the war. He had stayed true to himself, to his teacher's lessons, and he had been seen. He had been understood. He stood up, his legs feeling shaky, and walked to the front of the stage. He bowed, not just to the audience, but to the judges, and most of all, to the director. The roar of the applause intensified, washing over him like a warm wave. As he turned and walked off the stage, back into the familiar shadows of the wings, he felt different. The walk of shame he had taken earlier was gone, replaced by a walk of quiet triumph. He didn't need a trophy or a medal. He had already received his prize. It was the image of the director, the arbiter of musical perfection, rising to his feet to honor a boy who had dared to tell a story. He hadn't just won the competition. He had proven that sometimes the most powerful technique of all is a story that needs to be told.